I'm actually going to open with a poem by another poet, Lucille Clifton. If you, in the brief Q&A that we have afterwards, were to ask me who my favorite poets are, I will always answer Lucille Clifton. I'll then answer a number of other people just to fill it in and make it seem fair. This poem is called Generations. People who are going to be, in a few years, bottoms of trees, bear a responsibility to something besides people. If it was only you and me sharing the consequences, it would be different. It would be just generations of men. But this business of war, these war kinds of things, are erasing those natural, obedient generations who ignored pride, stood on no hind legs, begged no water, stole no bread, did their own thing. And the generations of rice, of coal, of grasshoppers, by their invisibility, denounce us. So, I write a lot about the world in which we live. Here's the very first poem of my very first book, which happens to be over there on the corner. Language. Silence is one part of speech. The war cry of wind down a mountain pass, another. A stranger's voice echoing through lonely valleys. A lover's voice rising so close, it's your own tongue. These are keys to cipher. The way the high hawk's key unlocks the throat of the sky and the coyote's yip knocks it shut. The way the aspen's bells conform to the breeze while the rapid's drum defines resistance. Sage speaks with one voice, Pinyon with another. Rock, wind her hand and water her brush, spells and then scatters her demands. Some notes tear and pebble our paths. Some notes gather, the bank we map our lives around. I found that I kind of always end up coming back to talking about the land. And I've also found, as a result, that people get confused about that, why that is, right? That there's a lot of things that somebody who walks through the world in a body that looks like mine are expected to write about, and maybe the flowers and trees are not the highest on that list. And so I thought I would read you a short essay that kind of starts to break a little bit into some of the reasons why this set of inquiries is one of the ones that preoccupies my mind. Our essay is called Diversity, a Garden Allegory with Suggestions for Direct Action. Dear America, when we first moved into our house, the yard was tame and orderly. There were 3 aspen trees in the rear corners of the backyard. Mostly the plant life consisted, though, of severely trimmed juniper bushes and a substantially weed-free lawn. Beds of river rock, so uniform in size and shape as to seem manufactured, edged these expanses of green. It was a well-manicured yard. This was the first thing about the house I set out to change. I've been pulling rock for 4 years now. Every spring before the heat comes on, and again in the fall before the cold settles, I rip out a new section of river rock and landscaping fabric. This is a slow process. The rock and plasticide landscaping fabric deplete the soil. Efforts to reduce natural diversity nearly always result in some form of depletion, and this certainly has been true in my yard. What I find beneath those repressed beds would be of little use to a garden. It's hard clay I have to amend with the compost I produce from kitchen scraps and fallen leaves. I also add topsoil hauled in from a landscaping supply store called Hageman Earth Cycle. I love the environmental vision inscribed in the name Earth Cycle. I also love climbing their small hills of topsoil to shovel some into my wheelbarrow and haul with me back home. It's the full body participation in promoting an ecologically vibrant landscape that excites me. I try to salvage native earthworms I find under the river rocks, tossing the wigglers back into my newly enriched beds. The work might go more quickly if I hired a bobcat to scoop the rock, but I work slowly, extracting and replanting desirable vegetation whose roots have grown into the landscaping fabric. I spare centipedes and pill bugs, do my best to avoid spiders. Once I found an anthill teeming with creatures who were busy tunneling into the difficult dirt. I left them where they were. Proceeding this way, it may take me 12 hours to prepare a satisfactory 3-square-foot plot. I'll sow this with wildflower seed, perennial starts, tulip bulbs, and iris's gangly rhizomes. Within months, I will enjoy a riot of color where once there was nothing but hard gray expanse. In the center of my lawn, and also in poorly irrigated corners that had been overtaken by crabgrass and purslane, I've started more flower beds. Making these, too, is a difficult process, but not the kind of process that takes place on my knees, as does the reclamation of the rock beds. The object on the lawn is to turn turf into rich soil. I cover the grass with layer on layer of cardboard, kitchen scraps, topsoil, compost, newspaper, and mulch. At the end of the long winter, I'll turn it all with a shovel and pitchfork. Then I will plant my seeds. I will begin around Halloween and must wait until nearly June before I can start to see any results. The process of changing my environment from homogeneous to diverse is rewarding, but slow. Because I garden by scattering seed, I never quite know what's going to appear or where. If, as Michael Pollan writes, a lawn is nature under totalitarian rule, my yard reveals a very different sort of possibility. My property yields an explosion of color come midsummer. You never know exactly what you'll find in my little patch, or whom. The August we moved into this house, I found canister upon canister of herbicides and pesticides on the work table in the garage. That first summer, very few pollinators braved the poisoned turf. They'd flit from one rare dandelion to the next, then buzz away, seemingly forlorn. But this year, I've counted numerous species of bee, more than 24 different kinds of birds, and a slew of moths and butterflies, including monarchs. I planted milkweed in many places around the yard. I planted other native plants as well. In some of this year's reclaimed beds, I planted handfuls of sunflower seeds left over from last year's crop. These have grown as high as 13 feet, delighting many species of neighbors, humans included. The brilliant goldfinches that hang out near our feeders eat my sunflower petals. I would prefer if they didn't eat my sunflower petals. But the sunflowers are there for them as much as they are for me, and I'm learning that birds eat flower petals, not just the seeds from the middles of the plant. Next year, to continue to attract these beautiful birds, I'll sow more sunflower seeds. The sunflowers and the birds who eat them fill me with joy I could not have imagined. The covenant for our homeowners association specifies that what I've done around my house is technically prohibited. There should be fewer wildflowers in my yard. Banish the milkweed. Banish the tall grass. Banish the front yard onion patch. And definitely the sad squash trials. When the sunflowers have finished flowering, rather than leave the dried stalks and seed heads for the birds to perch and munch on as they stock up for their winter migration, I should pull all remnants of the summer plants out of the ground. There should be nothing brown like that around the yard. Nothing that might be construed as aesthetically unsavory. Did I mention that my family is the only black family on our block? That we're some of the only black people in our neighborhood? That, in fact, we are one of the few black families in our entire town? Sidebar, in the 2010 census, my town was 1.2% African American alone. By which that census label, African American alone, means not of mixed race, but I mean, you know, sometimes language is right. That's all I'm saying. I say this now because it may help you to understand that my resistance to the particular brand of suburban American monoculture my HOA promotes is also a resistance to a culture that has been set up to exclude people like me. A culture that, through laws and customs that amount to toxic actions and culturally constructed weeding, has effectively maintained homogeneous spaces around houses like mine. But I'm lucky. My neighbors claim to be grateful I've moved in and cultivated the most heterogeneous environment on our street. And the bees love the flowers, and the sunflowers shade the low-growing plants at their bases, some of which flower and some of which don't. A whole new ecosystem is thriving in my yard. Hardly anyone used to visit, but now it is alive and full of action. Birds I don't see on any of the neighboring lawns have taken up regular habitation around our place. Several mating pairs chose spots in our various trees and bushes and nest and rest and raise their young. The worms I so carefully preserved provide tasty snacks for the robins. I released 9,000 ladybugs to help with an aphid infestation on my Rudbeckia plants. Now I've seen an increase in creatures feeding on the healthy black-eyed Susans, and probably on some ladybugs as well. Swallowtails, painted ladies, and the occasional monarch pass through the garden in late summer. When our aspens succumbed to the scale that struck many of the trees in the neighborhood this year, and we had to cut them down, there were still plenty of places for bugs and birds and squirrels to congregate, places that did not exist before I began the work of diversifying the landscape I found in my backyard. Though it fills me with joy to be surrounded by such vibrancy, keeping up with all of this isn't easy. This spring, it was as if every dandelion in the country called its neighbor to join them in our yard. I spent countless hours with my old-fashioned reed remover pulling weeds at the root. It occurs to me, doing this work, that one of the reasons we prefer homogeneity is that it can seem much easier. There is a man who comes to my house and fixes things. He's handy and smart and strong. He has an eye for order and structure, and I defer to him when it comes time to decide what type of stain to use on the deck. He recently offered to help me out with the weeds. A couple applications of chemical herbicide in my yard will surely look neat as a magazine photo. I will admit I have been tempted. My flower bed is spectacular, but the mounds of clover and bindweed scattering around the unimproved section detract from the overall grandeur of my lot. It's difficult to strike a balance between acceptance and dominance. I have to come to terms with the fact that maintaining a poison-free yard will mean revising some of my opinions about what plants I want around me and which I do not. This is one of the key glories of cultivating diversity. When we cultivate diversity, we learn things we never knew we might want to know, things we may even need to know one day. Neither our river rocks nor our turf grass are edible, but the dandelions, purslane, sunflowers, and cornflowers, and California poppies, and curly dock I either cultivate or tolerate all have some nutritive value. The vibrant variety in my yard can provide sustenance in all kinds of ways. Our first winter in this house was hard on me. The killing frost did what they do, and then there were months without flowers. I'm from California. This was really traumatic. February came, then March, and then April. And because of all that rock and turf, there was nothing to look at but gray and more gray until May came, and with it, some green. As I've spent the past years planting bulbs and seeds, and as I've put in perennial starts, and as I've swapped plant cuttings with friends, planting plots in their honor, and as I've divided and rearranged tubers, and as I've cultivated the diversity of my garden, I have grown happier, earlier, and earlier each spring. I didn't know I was that dependent on color, on variety, on watching so many different kinds of life being lived, but evidently I am. Yours, Camille. Thanks. So, Trophic Cascade is a biological term, an ecological biological term for what happens when a top predator trophy species is either removed or replaced from an environment, and the kinds of changes that happen along the way. And that became the conceptual center of this book, Trophic Cascade. After the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone, and as anticipated, their culling of deer, trees grew up beyond the deer stunt of the mid-century. In their upreach, songbirds nested, who scattered seed for underbrush, and in that cover warrened snowshoe hare, weasel, water shrew, returned. Also vole, and came soon hawk and falcon, bald eagle, kestrel, and with them hawk shadow, falcon shadow. Eagle shade and kestrel shade haunted newly buried runnels where mule deer no longer rummaged, cautious as they were now of being surprised by wolves. Berries brought bear, while undergrowth and willows, growing now right down to the river, brought beavers who dam. Muskrats came to the dam, and tadpoles. Came, too, the night song of the fathers of tadpoles. With water striders, the dark gray American dipper bobbed in fresh pools of the river, and fish stayed. And the bear who fished also culled deer fawns, and to their kill scraps came vulture and coyote, long gone in the region until now. And their scattered seed, and more trees, brush, and berries grew up along the river that had run straight and so flooded, but thus dammed, compelled to meander, is less prone to overrun. Don't you tell me this is not the same as my story. All this life born from one hungry animal, this whole new landscape, the course of the river changed. I know this. I reintroduced myself to myself, this time a mother, after which nothing was ever the same. So one thing that happened after I had my daughter is my eyes changed, which is like not one of the things that they tell you. I mean, they do tell you, but we don't listen. about what is possible to happen. And I'm just saying that because you may have noticed that I read that like significantly smaller font than the essay, and I read it with like old lady eyes, which I'm blaming on my daughter. But I'm also going to say, as a kind of craft thing, that particular poem always becomes difficult to me because of all the repetition, right? And so I'm really purposely playing in the poem with the different kinds of birds, for instance, and then the different kinds of bird shadows, or like, if you look at the poem, there's a lot of times where words or very similar words are stacked on top of each other, which works when we're listening to a poem, but just so you know, when you are in this position one day, get bigger font. It gets tricky to read. All right. So, natural history. The rufous hummingbird builds her nest of moss and spider webs and lichen. I held one once, smaller than my palm, but sturdy. I would have told Mrs. Jeffers from Court Street, if in those days of constant flights between California and Virginia, I'd wandered into that Oakland museum. Any chance I could, I'd leave my rented house in Lynchburg. I hated the feeling of stuckness that old city's humidity implied. You need to stop running away so much, Mrs. Jeffers would say, when my visits were over and I leaned down to hug her. Why, her words come to me, the woman dead for the better part of this new century, while I think of that nest of web and lichen, I cannot rightly say. She had once known my mother's parents. The whole lot of them, even then, in their 20s, must already have been as old as God. They were black. The kind name for them in those days would have been Negroes. And the daily elections called for between their safety and their sanity must have torn even the strongest of them down. Mr. Jeffers had been a laborer, the sort I regret I don't remember. He sat on their front porch all day near his oxygen tank, waving occasionally to passing Buicks and Fords, praising the black walnut that shaded their yard. She would leave the porch sometimes to prepare their meals. I still have her yeast roll recipe, the best I've ever tried. Mostly, though, the same Virginian breeze that encouraged Thomas Jefferson's tomatoes passed warmly through their porch eaves while we listened to the swing chains, and no one talked or moved too much at all. Little had changed in that house since 1952. I guess it's no surprise they come to mind when I think of that cup of spider webs and moss made softer by the feathers of some long-gone bird. She used to say, I like it, right here, where I am, in my little house, here, with him. I thought her small-minded. In the winter, I didn't visit very often. Their house was closed up and overheated. Everything smelled of chemical mothballs. She had plastic wrappers on the sofas and chairs. Everyone must have once held someone as old and small and precious as this. So I feel like I'm doing one of those like backwards chronologies in life things with this reading. I start with I'm uber suburban lady dealing with my front lawn. And then I told you about when I started my family. Then I told you about the before. So let's go all the way back, right? To listen for, at the tail end of every line in this poem, you will get a word from Gwendolyn Brooks's We Real Cool. Because it looked hotter that way, we let our hair down. It wasn't so much that we worried about what people thought or about keeping it real, but that we knew this was our moment. We knew we'd blow our cool sooner or later. Probably sooner. Probably even before we got too far out of Westmont High and had kids of our own who left home wearing clothes we didn't think belonged in school. Like Mrs. C, whose nearly unrecognizably pretty senior photo we passed every day on the way to gym. We'd get old. Or like Mr. Lurk, who told us all the time how it's never too late to throw a Hail Mary like he did his junior year, and how we could win everything for the team and hear the band strike up a tune so the cheer squad could sing our names too. Straight out of a Hallmark movie, Mr. Lurk's hero-turned-teacher story. We had heard it a million times. Sometimes he'd ask us to sing with him. T-O-N-Y-L-U-R-K, Tony, Tony, lurk, lurk, lurk. Sin arreglio consentimiento, por favor. And then we would get back to our Spanish lessons, opening our thin textbooks until the bell rang and we went on to the cotton gin in history. Really, this had nothing to do with being cool. We only wanted to have a moment to ourselves, a moment before jazz band and after gym, when we could look in the mirror and like it. June and Tiffany and Janet all told me I looked pretty. We took turns saying nice things, though we might just as likely say die and go to hell. Beauty or hell, no difference. The bell would ring soon. Thanks. So, that's the cool thing about being a poet. It's like you get to be halfway between being a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer, right? I really had a dear friend named Janet. I did not have one named June, but that was one of the words I had to work with. I went to West High, not Westmont High, but, and my English teacher was improbably beautiful in her high school picture, but she actually remained quite attractive through her life. And we've all had a Mr. Lurk, haven't we? One way or another. All right. I'm going to go all the way back to a time before me. But, I show up anyway. What I know I cannot say. We sailed to Angel Island, and for several hours, I did not think of you. When I couldn't stop myself, finally, from thinking of you, it was not really you, but the trees. Not really the trees, but their strange pods blooming for a while longer. A bloom more like the fringe fan at the tip of a peacock's tail than anything I'd call a flower. And so I was thinking about flowers and what we value in a flower more than I was thinking of the island or its trees, and much more than I was thinking of you. Recursive language ties us together, linguists say. I am heading down this road. I am heading down this road despite the caution signs and the narrow shoulders. I am heading down the curvy road despite the caution signs and the narrow shoulders because someone I fell in love with once lived around here. Right there. That is an example of recursive language. Every language, nearly every language in the world demands recursion. Few things bring us together more than our need to spell out our intentions, which helps explain the early 20th century Chinese prisoners who scratched poems into walls on Angel Island, and why a Polish detainee wrote his mother's name in 1922. I was here, they wanted to tell us. And by here, they meant the island. And they also meant the world. And by the island, they meant the world they knew, and they also meant the world they left, and the world they wanted to believe could be theirs. The world they knew required passwords. Think of Angel Island Immigration Station as purgatory, the guide explained. He told tales of paper fathers, picture brides, the fabrications of familiarity so many lives depended on. Inquiries demanded consistency despite the complications of interpretation. In English, one would ask, how many windows were in your house in the village? How many ducks did you keep? What was the shape of the birthmark on your father's left cheek? In Japanese, Cantonese, Danish, Punjabi, the other answered. Then it all had to come back to English. The ocean is wide and treacherous between one home and the other. There can be no turning back, no correction once what is said is said. Who can blame the Chinese detainees who carved poems deep into the wood on Angel Island's walls? Who can blame the Salvadoran who etched his village's name? Few things tie us together more than our need to dig up the right words to justify ourselves. Travelers and students, we sailed into the bay, disembarked on Angel Island. I didn't think about you. Which is to say, the blue gum eucalyptus is considered a threat, though we brought it across oceans to help us. Desired first for its timber because it grows quickly and was expected to provide a practical fortune, and when it did not, enlisted as a windbreak, desired still because it is fast growing and practical, the blue gum has colonized the California coastal forest, squeezing out native plants, dominating the landscape, and increasing the danger of fire. I should hate the blue gum eucalyptus. But from the well of their longing, by which I mean to say from their pods. You know what I mean, I hope. From the well of their longing, blooms explode like fireworks. I love them for this. Do you hear me? I absolve you. You are far too beautiful and singular to blame. So I'm going to give you 2 more poems, and then I'm going to answer 2 questions, and then I'm going to release you to the cheesecake and cookies. And I would love to sign books or notebooks or whatever, like your forehead. Ross Gay came to our school once and signed a person's shoe, which I think is the most rock star move ever. So I would love to do that for one of you, maybe. Because I think so much of what this is, what you're doing here, I don't know, you might be required to be here for a class, but there is this thing that happens eventually once you are in the company of living writing for a while, where it starts to be, you get to be part of this conversation, and you get to be in this space where you've talked to people who want to talk to you about things that matter in the world in ways that they hope move you, right? I saw that list of folks that have come this semester, and I'm super duper happy to be in the company of Hanifa Diraqib and Tayari Jones and Nicole Walker, who are all amazing humans and writers. So side story I told at dinner also, the worst thing that I ever did in my life around literature was get a book by Allen Ginsberg signed by Allen Ginsberg the year before Allen Ginsberg died for my ex-boyfriend who lived in England. I don't have that book. So you can buy a book for your boyfriend and also have me sign like a notebook paper or something like that, if that's what needs to happen. All right. So
or
you can make your boyfriend buy his own book. That's another, and give him the notebook paper. That's another thing that could happen. I was looking for a love poem, but I couldn't find one. Okay, so I wanted to leave you with two ideas. And one of the ideas has to do with the sort of continuity of hope and possibility and language. And the other one has to do with continuity of empathy and care. So I will begin with both what language can and can't do. Commute. He remembers the harp in his pocket and the tune to a time-winding blues. Baby, I am tied to you forever. I am tied to you forever. I can't quit you, baby. I can't even put you down. This tunnel looks like love gone hurtling into darkness. Across the track, a couple nods, appreciating something they can't put their fingers on. He tucks the harp back in his pocket, thinks to smile at her. It's all quiet for a while, but the wind, and then their train. And then you guys may have noticed that I'm kind of geeky in my poems and writing, like there's like something I'm interested in and I just like write my way through it. But I don't want you to necessarily think that what happens is I like acquire all that language about like recursive language and then like immediately it goes into a poem. Usually what happens is it just like hangs out in me for a while as I think about it and it pings off other ideas and it'll show up eventually. How long that eventuality is depends on the situation. Here's my final poem for you. One night in 1888, as the French steamboat Abdelkader powered from Marseille to Algiers, news reports proclaim the sky became quite black with swallows. The channel between one life and another has always been subject to sudden explosions. Those swallows must have been exhausted. The birds alighted in the thousands on the sails, ropes, and yards of the Abdelkader. I began with birds, thousands. Some wandered into cabins, ate from passengers' delighted hands. I will return to the birds, but you should know the Abdel-Qadir was named for a man who died 5 years before they blacked the sky around the boat that bore his name. If you don't know how many died, how many more he saved in the decades of conflict between France and Algiers while Abdel-Qadir was emir, maybe you won't know what a wonder this was to report. I read about it in the New York Times. This must have sounded in those days like the stories we hear now of cranes, white-napped, red-capped, who nest nowhere securely but along Korea's demilitarized zone. Those winged strangers remained all night on the vessel, the article claims. In the morning, fed and rested, they flew off for coastal islands still controlled by Spain, which, as you know, once kept as its own our neighbors, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico. I've been trying to write about the Abdel-Qadir swallows for more years than I'm able to count. Yesterday, you apologized for arriving late for dinner. You'd seen a small, bent woman walking with heavy bags near the grocery store, and you stopped to ask if she would let you drive her home. You are the size of black man people here consider frightening. The woman must have been exhausted. She settled her body in the cabin, and you carried her safely home. Some days, especially as I am reminded of how we fight the animals we are, who need to migrate as much as we need to settle, to stay, how we'll tear apart and strand and starve and slaughter that part of us who takes flight from one place to some other. I try to recreate this. A rather curious episode in natural history occurred the other day. The story I love so much begins. Thank you.